The autumn wind whispered through the golden fields, rustling the tall grass in waves that stretched toward the horizon. The sky, a soft blend of gray and amber, carried the promise of an approaching evening. Maggie Dawson, an elderly woman with silver-streaked hair and tired but sharp blue eyes, stepped carefully along the worn dirt path leading to her small farmhouse. For most of her life, this land had been her world: vast fields, old wooden fences, and a quiet, simple life. But now it was different. The once lively farm had grown still. The laughter of loved ones long faded into memory. Maggie adjusted the basket on her hip, filled with a few dried apples and twigs she had collected along the way. Her breath was steady but slow, her body worn from years of hard work. Yet, she carried herself with the quiet strength of someone who had learned to survive even when life tried to break her. Just as she was about to turn toward home, a faint sound drifted through the crisp air. A cry. It was barely audible over the rustling wind, but it was there, soft, weak, almost pleading. Maggie paused, her brow furrowing. She tilted her head, listening. The sound came again. It was coming from the old, abandoned barn at the far end of her land, a place she hadn't stepped foot in for years. Something about the cry made her heart tighten. It wasn't just the sound of an animal. It was the sound of something helpless, something that had been left behind. Without hesitation, Maggie adjusted her shawl and made her way toward the barn, her boots crunching against the dry grass. The wind picked up as she neared, the wooden structure creaking in protest against the changing season. The once sturdy barn was now faded and leaning slightly, its red paint peeling with time. Maggie reached the entrance, hesitated for a moment, then pushed open the heavy door. The hinges groaned in protest, and dust swirled in the fading light. Then she saw it. Curled in the farthest corner of the barn, half hidden behind a pile of old hay, was a tiny, frail pony. Its coat was a pale, ghostly white, streaked with dirt and dried blood. Its ribs pressed against its thin skin, its legs trembling with exhaustion. Its eyes, strikingly blue and filled with fear, stared up at her. Maggie's breath caught. For a moment she simply stood there, taking in the heartbreaking sight before her. The little creature didn't move, didn't cry out again. It just watched her, too weak to run, too tired to fight. Slowly, carefully, Maggie stepped closer. "Easy there, sweetheart," she murmured, her voice soft as a lullaby. "I'm not going to hurt you." The pony flinched but didn't look away. Kneeling down, Maggie reached out her hand, palm open, allowing the small pony to see she meant no harm. For a moment there was nothing but silence. Then, ever so slightly, the pony stretched its muzzle forward, its breath warm against her fingertips. Maggie's heart swelled. "You're a fighter, aren't you?" she whispered, blinking back, an unexpected sting in her eyes. She could see it now. This wasn't just some abandoned foal. It had been left here, forgotten, unwanted. Not anymore. Maggie removed her shawl and gently draped it over the pony's frail body. The little creature shivered, but when she carefully slid her arms under its thin frame and lifted it, it didn't resist. It was light. Too light. Holding the trembling foal close to her chest, Maggie turned and stepped out of the barn, her grip firm yet gentle. As she carried the pony home, the wind whispered through the fields once more, carrying with it the first leaves of autumn. And for the first time in years, Maggie didn't feel alone. The fire crackled warmly in the hearth, filling the small farmhouse with a soft, golden glow. The scent of hay, old wood, and burning cedar drifted through the air, mingling with the faint aroma of apples Maggie had left on the table. Wrapped in a thick woolen blanket, the small pony lay on a bed of fresh hay near the fire, its body still weak but no longer trembling. Maggie sat beside it, gently stroking its mane. She had cleaned its wounds, given it fresh water, and fed it small pieces of apple. At first, the pony had hesitated, but hunger had won over fear. Now, as she ran her fingers through its soft white coat, she felt the tension in its small frame begin to ease. "You're safe now," she murmured, watching as its blue eyes blinked drowsily. She let out a soft chuckle. "I suppose you need a name, don't you?" The pony made a small, almost whisper-like noise in response. Maggie smiled. "Whisper," she said softly. "That's what I'll call you." The name felt right, delicate, yet strong, just like him. Days turned into weeks. Whisper, once frail and timid, slowly regained his strength. He followed Maggie everywhere, never too far, never wanting to be alone. At first, he was wary of the world outside the farmhouse, flinching at the rustling wind, the chirping birds, the creaking fences. But Maggie was patient. She would sit with him under the oak tree in the afternoons, letting him nuzzle against her hand as she spoke to him about anything and everything. Her past, her dreams, the way the seasons changed. And Whisper listened. Soon, he became braver. He learned to trot alongside Maggie as she gathered firewood, playfully nudging at her when she took too long. One day, as she struggled to lift a small bucket of water, he bent his head down and gripped the handle between his teeth, carrying it for her. Maggie had laughed, her voice ringing through the farm. "You really are something special, aren't you?" she said, patting his neck with pride. Whisper neighed softly, as if he understood. But what Maggie didn't know, what she couldn't yet see, was that their peaceful days together would soon be threatened. Because beyond the fields, beyond the quiet safety of their world, whispers were already spreading, rumors of a strange white pony, a creature too big, too smart, too different. And as history had proven time and time again, people feared what they did not understand. This is just the first part of the script, keeping it deeply emotional and immersive while mirroring the original viral story. The autumn air had grown colder. The once golden fields were now tinged with the crisp bite of approaching winter, the trees shedding their leaves one by one. Whisper had grown stronger. His once frail frame had filled out, his legs steady and sure. He no longer feared the rustling of the wind or the calls of the crows that perched on the farmhouse roof. But something had changed. Maggie had noticed it first when she ventured into town one morning for supplies. The usual warm greetings from the shopkeeper were replaced with hesitant glances. Conversations hushed when she walked by. People were whispering, "Have you heard? The old woman's got some kind of ghost horse. They say it's unnatural, too big, too smart. No pony should act like that." Maggie stiffened as she placed her basket on the counter. She had heard rumors spread before, and she had no patience for town gossip. But something in the air felt different this time. It wasn't just idle talk. It was fear. As she paid for her goods, she overheard a woman whisper, "What if it's dangerous?" Maggie gritted her teeth. They didn't know him, but deep in her heart she also knew how quickly fear could turn to something worse. That night, as she sat on the porch watching Whisper trot around the yard, she felt an unease settle in her chest. "They don't know you like I do, boy," she murmured, running her fingers through his silky mane. "But people fear what they don't understand." Whisper nuzzled into her hand, his blue eyes filled with trust. Maggie sighed. She only hoped that trust would be enough. The first snowfall came early that year, dusting the fields with a thin blanket of white. Maggie wrapped a thick scarf around her shoulders and grabbed her basket. She didn't like going into town often, but there were some things she couldn't grow or make herself. Whisper, as always, followed close behind, his coat almost blending with the snow. She had considered leaving him at home, but something in his eyes when she reached for the gate made her hesitate. "You want to come, don't you?" she chuckled. Whisper bobbed his head. Maggie sighed. "All right then, but stay close." The walk to Willow's Hollow was peaceful at first. The sky was overcast, and the air smelled of pine and smoke from distant chimneys. But the moment they stepped onto the cobblestone streets of town, the atmosphere shifted. The usual market chatter faded into an uneasy silence. A woman carrying a sack of flour froze mid-step, her eyes widening. Children, who had been playing near the bakery, dropped their wooden toys and ran inside. Whisper slowed, sensing the tension. His ears flicked back as Maggie placed a reassuring hand on his neck. Then a voice rang out. "It's the ghost horse!" A murmur swept through the crowd like wildfire. "He shouldn't be here. It's unnatural. What if it turns on someone?" Maggie's jaw tightened. "He's not a danger to anyone." But fear had already taken root. A man stepped forward, gripping a wooden staff. "No horse should be that size. No animal should act like that." Another man joined in. "We should drive it out before something bad happens." Whisper took a small step back, his eyes flicking toward Maggie for reassurance. She lifted her chin. "You'll do no such thing." But then a rock flew through the air. It missed, landing in the dirt near Whisper's hooves, but it was enough. He flinched, startled, and in that moment of hesitation, the town seized its chance. "Get the ropes!" A thick coil of rope flew toward Whisper's legs. He tried to jump back, but he was too late. The loop tightened around his front leg. Maggie screamed, "No! Let him go!" More ropes flew. Whisper reared up in panic, but the men pulled hard. He stumbled, crashing to the ground. A desperate, heart-wrenching cry tore from his throat. Maggie fought against the crowd, her voice raw with fury. "Stop this! He's just a pony!" But no one listened. Fear had already won. They dragged Whisper through the dirt, his white coat streaked with mud and snow. His breaths came in ragged gasps, his blue eyes wide with confusion. Maggie fought with everything she had. "You don't understand," she cried, shoving against the men. "He's not dangerous. He's my family." But they weren't listening. They pulled him toward an old, abandoned stable at the edge of town. The wooden doors creaked as they shoved him inside. The last thing he saw before the doors slammed shut was Maggie, her face twisted in anguish. Then, darkness. The walk home was the longest of Maggie's life. She had fought, she had screamed, and still, they had taken him. The moment she stepped inside her farmhouse, the silence hit her. The space felt too empty, too cold. She sank into her chair, staring at the door, waiting for it to open. But it never did. The hours dragged into night. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, but Maggie didn't move. She whispered his name, again and again. But he wasn't there. A tear slipped down her cheek. Her hands, once so steady, now trembled in her lap. She was so tired. Her body had been failing for months, but she had fought to stay strong, for him. But now, he was gone. Her breathing slowed, and that night, as the fire in the hearth flickered and dimmed, Maggie Dawson closed her eyes for the last time. Under the pale morning light, the villagers stood in uneasy silence near the stable. Their fear had begun to wane, replaced by guilt and the quiet realization that they had made a terrible mistake. Thomas Whitmore, the village elder, ran a hand over his weathered face before stepping forward. He had seen many things in his long life, but the sight of the white pony trapped and beaten down by fear was something that sat heavy in his chest. "Let him go," he said, his voice steady but carrying a weight of regret. Some of the men hesitated, their hands still gripping the ropes that had once bound Whisper, but Thomas's stern gaze left no room for argument. A blade was drawn, and one by one, the ropes fell away. For a long moment, Whisper did not move. He stood frozen, his body stiff with exhaustion, his blue eyes clouded with sorrow. Then, as if something deep inside him suddenly reignited, he bolted. His hooves pounded against the frozen earth, kicking up the thin layer of snow as he raced toward the only home he had ever known. The wind rushed past him, burning against his face, but he did not slow down. The only thought in his mind, the only feeling in his heart, was getting back to Maggie. He had been taken from her, stolen away, and now every second mattered. He had to reach her. He had to see her again. The moment he reached the small farmhouse, something in his heart clenched. The door was ajar, swaying slightly in the winter breeze. Whisper slowed his steps, his breath heavy and uneven as he carefully nudged it open with his nose. The warmth that usually filled the home was gone. The fire in the hearth had long since burned out, leaving behind nothing but cold ashes. And then he saw her. Maggie lay still on her bed, her hands gently resting on her chest, her face peaceful as if she were simply sleeping. But Whisper knew better. He knew before he even stepped forward, before he even pressed his muzzle against her cool, unmoving fingers. She was gone. A deep, mournful sound rumbled from his throat, a cry not just of sorrow but of something more profound, an understanding that he had arrived too late. He had fought to come back, had run harder than he ever had before, but it hadn't been enough. The woman who had saved him, who had loved him when no one else had, was no longer there to greet him. He curled beside her bed, lowering his head to rest near her hand, unwilling to accept the truth. His breath was slow, his body still, as if he thought that by waiting, by refusing to move, he could somehow bring her back. The villagers arrived at the farmhouse hours later, their steps quiet, their expressions solemn. Word had spread of Maggie's passing, and though many had once feared her and the strange pony she had taken in, they now stood in silent respect. When they stepped inside, they found Whisper exactly as he had been when he arrived, curled beside her, unmoving, his blue eyes dull with grief. No one spoke at first. Even the usual creak of the wooden floorboards felt intrusive in the heavy stillness of the room. Thomas was the first to move, walking slowly toward Whisper. He reached out a hand, placing it gently against the pony's neck. "She's gone, my friend," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Whisper did not flinch, did not react. He only breathed in slow, deep intervals, as if time itself had stopped for him. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, the villagers helped prepare a resting place for Maggie beneath the old oak tree near the house. It was the tree she had always loved, the place where she had sat on warm afternoons, watching the world with quiet contentment. The earth was cold and stiff, but the men worked carefully, making sure everything was done with dignity. Whisper followed them, watching as they gently laid Maggie to rest. He did not try to stop them. He simply stood beside her, his large frame casting a long shadow over the ground. When the last bit of earth was placed over her grave, he stepped forward and pressed his muzzle against the mound, as if saying a final goodbye. The days stretched into weeks, and Whisper remained near Maggie's grave. No matter the weather, whether the cold wind carried the last remnants of autumn or the crisp frost of early winter settled over the land, he refused to leave the spot beneath the old oak tree. The villagers watched from a distance, unsure of what to do. The white pony, once feared and shunned, had become a silent guardian of the land he had once shared with the woman who saved him. At first, no one dared approach him. They knew what they had done. They had stolen him away from Maggie when she had needed him most, and in doing so, they had cost him the only family he had ever known. Guilt ran deep, and for a time, the town simply let Whisper grieve in solitude. But as the days passed, their fear turned into something else, remorse. It was a young girl, no older than 10, who made the first move. One chilly morning, she tiptoed across the field, her small hands clutching a bundle of fresh hay. Whisper didn't move as she approached, his blue eyes distant and filled with quiet sorrow. The girl hesitated, then gently placed the hay beside him before retreating. She didn't try to touch him. She didn't speak. She simply offered kindness. Slowly, others followed. A farmer left a bucket of water near the oak tree. An elderly woman placed apples beside Maggie's grave, a silent offering of regret. Even the men who had once thrown ropes around Whisper now stood at a distance, their expressions filled with guilt they did not know how to voice. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Thomas Whitmore stood at the edge of the field, watching the white pony with quiet reverence. He had been wrong, they all had. The town had let fear dictate their actions, and in the end, they had destroyed something irreplaceable. "We must make it right," he murmured, though he knew no apology could undo what had already been done. As winter settled over the land, Whisper's grief remained, but his presence began to shift. He still stood by Maggie's grave, but he was no longer frozen in sorrow. He moved through the fields, his steps slow but steady. He watched over the village, appearing at the outskirts, his gaze always scanning, always protecting. It was on a particularly harsh winter night that the town truly saw who Whisper had become. A terrible storm swept across Willow's Hollow, the wind howling through the town with a fury they had not seen in years. Snow piled high, blurring the landscape into a cold, white abyss. The roads became treacherous, and the temperature dropped dangerously low. Most of the townspeople stayed inside, huddled by their fires, hoping the storm would pass. But not everyone made it home in time. A group of travelers, lost in the storm, struggled through the blinding snow, their horses exhausted, their supplies dwindling. Panic set in as the night deepened. They couldn't see the path. They couldn't tell which direction led to safety. The cold bit through their coats, seeping into their bones. Hope was slipping away. And then they saw him. A white figure emerged through the blizzard, his pale coat nearly blending into the storm. But his blue eyes glowed with purpose. Whisper stood tall, his breath misting in the freezing air. He had found them. One of the travelers gasped, "It's the ghost horse." Whisper turned and walked ahead, his head low, his steps confident, leading them forward. At first, they hesitated. Was this real? But as they followed, they soon realized he was guiding them with certainty, his hooves moving through the deep snow with ease. Mile after mile, Whisper led them, his strong body cutting a path through the storm. The travelers, once lost and freezing, now had a guide, a protector. Hours later, when they finally saw the lights of Willow's Hollow, relief flooded them. Whisper had saved their lives. When the villagers heard of what had happened, something changed forever. "He's not a ghost," Thomas Whitmore said that night as they gathered near Maggie's grave, the storm now nothing but a memory. "He's our guardian." From that day on, Whisper was no longer just a pony, he was a legend. As the years passed, his presence became a constant in Willow's Hollow. Farmers would find him standing near their fields, keeping watch. When children strayed too far from home, Whisper would appear, nudging them back toward safety. During harsh winters, he led lost travelers back to the village, his instincts sharper than any map. The fear that had once ruled the town was long forgotten. Instead, Whisper became a symbol of protection, loyalty, and redemption. One spring, the villagers decided to build a permanent memorial for Maggie and Whisper beneath the great oak tree. They placed a stone marker at her grave, inscribed with words that would be remembered for generations. She saved him, and in return, he saved us all. Over time, Whisper's mane grew streaked with silver, but his spirit never faded. He remained a silent guardian, watching over the town with unwavering devotion. Some whispered that he was waiting for the day he would see Maggie again. Then, one summer morning, he was gone. The villagers searched the fields, the hills, the winding paths he once walked, but Whisper had disappeared. Some believed he had wandered off to find peace. Others claimed they saw him one last time, standing on the highest hill, gazing toward the horizon, before vanishing like mist in the morning sun. But no one ever forgot him. To this day, the legend of Whisper, the white guardian of Willow's Hollow, is told to every child born in the village. They grow up knowing that true loyalty never fades, that love can transcend even death, and that sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones who ask for nothing in return. And if you ever find yourself lost in the countryside on a cold night, when the wind howls through the trees and the path home feels uncertain, you might just hear the sound of hoofbeats in the distance. For some bonds are never truly broken. Whisper's story is more than just a tale about a pony and an old woman. It is a story that belongs to all of us. It teaches us that fear can blind us, but love can open our eyes, that loyalty and kindness are the strongest forces in the world, and that even when someone is gone, their presence can still be felt if we choose to remember them. It reminds us that no act of love is ever wasted, that no bond, no matter how unusual, no matter how different, should ever be dismissed. And most importantly, it reminds us that true love, the kind that protects, endures, and waits, never truly leaves us. If this story touched your heart, make sure to hit the subscribe button for more emotional, inspiring stories like this one. Join us as we continue to share tales of love, loyalty, and the bonds that shape us.